Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interviewed Joshua Sooter, a former Ph.D. student at New York University, to talk about religion and the anti-Christian movement in China in the early 20th century. Joshua, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So you are yet another China scholar who we're having on this season. Can you tell us what it is that you're specifically looking at? What are you arguing? And can you give us a little bit of the historical context around what you're arguing?
Yeah. My research was essentially on the concept of religion in the mid and late 19th century of the Qing Empire. And historically, what is going on, right? This is a time of great uncertainty and change and social upheaval within China, from the penetration of capitalist forms of production, from imperialist pressures, and with a lot of just issues that the Qing state was struggling with for quite some time were kind of coming to fruition, were exacerbated by these social forces. Academically, the context is part of I would see my work as a part of a longer conversation about the role of religion in Chinese society. But I think my work is kind of taking a step back and saying, like, well, what is this? What do we mean by saying concept? What do we mean by religion, right? And I am not the first person to have done that, but I think some of my research I was the first person to, I think, study the concept of religion historically before there is an actual linguistic term and signification, like, which means basically before there's a word for religion, I think religion was there as a new concept that didn't exist in China previously, because religion is a very modern idea.
Yeah. So can you go into this idea a little bit more? How then were people in China talking about this notion of religion? What terms were they using? How were they understanding it from the research that you've done?
Yeah. So I think that it's helpful to take a step back here and even to say where this concept, this idea of religion is, because we take it for granted now, right? Well, people have religion, people have this, they have you have sex, you have a gender, right? Well, just as scholars such as, say, Michel Foucault, right, has talked about, no one had sexuality, right, before, say, the 17th, 18th century, right? It's a concept that doesn't exist. There are just things that you do, right? Religion is like that, where it comes out of particularly the Catholic and Protestant wars in Europe, after the medieval period and after the Reformation. And there's this sense that religion, or the things that you do, which religion means Christianity, it means to practice something that comes from the Latin religio, right? It becomes not something that is just a part of everyday life, a part of everyday governance, right? A part of the state, a part of your social obligations and your family ties. It becomes something private and personal. This is one of the ways that, essentially, and make a very long story short, essentially, Europeans come up with in order to stop from killing each other over this stuff, right? So this idea is exported and even expanded further with, say, the colonizations of the New World, right? When they're for the first time going out, Europeans, and they're meeting people who are neither Christian, right? They're neither heretics, that is to say, from their perspective, Muslim world, right? And the word heathen doesn't always work for them either. So they have to have a new category. Like, what is this? What do we see when these people are making sacrifices, when they seem to be praying? It's very different, but it looks kind of similar. And this is where the kind of our idea of religion comes from. Now, China, at this point, I would argue before the mid 19th century, doesn't have this concept of religion. What we would call religion is present in everyday life. It's present in from a personal level to a familial level, right? There are practices that every family will engage in, right? To offer local sacrifices or little for incense, or to pray, right? For a host of deities, Buddhist, what we would call Buddhist, Taoist, folk religion, right? So you might, a woman in your family might go to the Buddhist temple and offer some prayers, and then say you might offer prayers to the mountain god or some incense to the mountain god later in the day, right? And you have all these festivals and things that really tie the village together as a hierarchical place that is a hierarchy between men and women, that's a hierarchy between fathers and sons, right? That's very Confucius formulations, parents and children. But it also ties into the relationship between the state and local life and the individual, right? So local gentry, right? Local wealthy people, wealthy landed people, or the local magistrates and officials from the Qing state itself would preside over festivals, and these would ritually tie you to the emperor and the emperors and state, thereby state power. So what we would call religion is very present, but they wouldn't, if you ask someone, are you religious, or what is your religion, or there's no, you can't ask that, because these things are tied into so many different aspects of your identity, of your social life, of your relationship to the state, all these things, right? So they wouldn't have understood that question, and they didn't even have a way, you couldn't have asked it in Chinese, because it's the Chinese word zongjiao, which is religion, right? It doesn't exist in this point. That is actually it's a borrowed term from Japan in the early 20th century. So that's a key point. Hang on to that one.
Yeah. Well, I want to drive into this a little more. You've already kind of answered the question here, but I think we can try to stab at it a little deeper. You write in the materials that you sent me that the concept of religion spread globally to new contexts and societies throughout the world during the 19th century, including the Qing Empire, 1644 to 1911, and its Chinese population. Before that point, the notions of religion were not present in Chinese thinking. So I want to kind of throw you into this larger debate that, historians of Chinese religion have been having for a while. And again, you've already kind of answered this, but should we consider something like Buddhism and Taoism a religion? Is that a sufficient term when talking about it today? Or is this still sort of like a troubled way of thinking about these practices that Chinese people are still participating in even today? Where do you place yourself in that debate? And if you propose that we change the term, what should we be calling it?
I wouldn't propose necessarily changing any terms. I think as a scholar, I like describing things as what they are, right? But I also realize that we have categories and we have concepts, and we bring them with us, right? So I think that how I would relate myself to that debate, right, is, were there religions in China, right? Is that I would say, like, this is a really false debate. This is a really false dichotomy, right? The question itself presupposes that there's something called religion, that it actually exists in the world, right? Instead of a term that we can be as scholars, that we can be as everyday people, right, actually call something. And so when we say, like, well, is this a religion or not? Oh, is that religion? Is Buddhism, in practice, is it a religion in China? We've already kind of made the misstep of saying, like, well, there's something called religion that's actually real in the world, right? And so I found that the interesting thing for me was to say, like, well, where did the ability to ask that question even come from? How was that historically formulated, right? And you have, at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, you have people like Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao, and many others, right? These are the big names. His Chinese scholar, right? Jing scholars, who are asking, like, well, does China have a religion? And should it have a national religion? What is our religion? What religions do we have? Is religion good or bad for the uh, progress of society? Right? Is our bad religion the reason why China is in a weakened political and diplomatic state? Right? Has this, socially, has this stunted our progress towards another concept, right? Modernity, right? Category. Why aren't we modern? Is it religion? And I think that a lot of the problem is that, like, scholars have taken up these questions unknowingly. Instead of interrogating those questions, they said, well, was China's religion was either good or bad, or like, well, these weren't really religions, these are something else. Or like, oh, well, I think this is a religion and that's not, right? Oh, these little folk, we call it practices, those aren't religion, but Buddhism is, right? Because that has all the characteristics of a religion. It has an organized clergy, it has memberships, and blah 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 blah, right? And instead, that's really just reifying, that's recreating, right, these questions instead of asking a deeper question, right? Which I think is how I saw my work. So I was trying to do anyway.
One important aspect of your research in the materials you sent me is you talk about how in the 20th century, among some groups, there was a growing distaste for the missionaries and Christian movements that were operating in China. Notably, one of those people being Chen Duxiu, who's one of the foundational members of the Chinese Communist Party. Can you talk a little bit about the beginnings of this movement and some of the context around that?
Yeah. So there's a very long history of scholarship on, missionary presence in China, and of course, missionaries as kind of these handmaidens of imperialism, right? More generally, and so I should. There's a couple different phases to missionary work in China, right? And so I think especially, well, we tend to just jump from the Jesuits, right? In, like, say, the 16th, 17th century, and their kind of interactions with the Chinese state, like Ming and Qing, right? Where they are essentially trying to become very Chinese in their mannerisms, in their ways of scholarship. They are reading and speaking Mandarin fluently, right? And there's a real interest in China, or in Europe, right, about Confucian practices, about China as a state, right? Voltaire is very interested in these things, right? So you move kind of from this slowly into the 19th century. In the early 19th century, you have an influx of Protestant missionaries. And at this point, the Qing state is still pretty strong. It's still, Qing society is still very wealthy, and the kind of level of predominance of power has not entirely shifted into kind of the favor of, say, the Europeans and Americans. Right? And so in the early 19th century, 1840s, 1830s, before this, you have these missionaries who are really trying to embed themselves within the local culture. They are kind of trying to understand it. They are very much kind of participant observers. And this slowly starts to change over the course of the 19th century as the Opium Wars progress in the 1840s and the 1860s. You have the Taiping Rebellion, the 1850s and 60s, right? And these are massive, massive events that just rock the foundations of the Qing state, of Chinese society, and they start among Chinese scholars. They open up all these questions of, well, how is it that these foreigners have become so powerful, right? How is it that these modern machines, how is it these medicines, these ways of knowing and organizing, like militaries or states or corporations, right? How is it that these are so effective? And for the Europeans and Americans, this is taken as kind of a sign of their own. It's taken to be, how should I put it? It just proves everything that they've started to suspect about themselves, right? That they are modern, that they are more rational, that their ways are better. And you start to see this with the missionary kind of presence, where the missionaries start asking questions about, like, well, what is wrong with Chinese religion, right? It's the Chinese, if you only convert to our religion, you go in a better direction, right? So this is how, especially, we can talk about it maybe in more detail later, but after the Second Opium War and the Taiping uprisings, that this idea, this concept of religion really kind of sneaks in, and it really starts being utilized even before there's kind of a term for it in Chinese. So that's where my work mostly picks up.
So when we talk about this movement, what exactly was I guess to think of it simply their end game in um, writing about these Christian missionaries and writing about notions of what's right and wrong for China?
Well, let have to back up a little bit, right?
Sure.
So especially essentially after the Second Opium War and the Taiping uprising, Christian missionaries are allowed to go deeper into China and to actually live in villages, right? And they start proselytizing and converting, and they do this through all kinds of ways. Like, they bring medicines, they bring schools, they incentivize people. Sometimes there are outright payments for people to convert, right? And people in a society that has had a lot of upheaval, that is in tatters, social relationships are stretched or damaged, start to convert. And what happens is that, you say you're going to church, and the missionaries are advocating for you against the Qing state. And so the Qing state could come and say, conscript you for labor projects. We need a new dam to be built. We need a new road here, or this needs done, right? And they could just kind of take you for a couple months, and, like, you have to work on that project. You have to give money to the local gentry landlords, right? Or the local official, in order to pay for the religious festivals, right? These are all kind of things that are expected that you do. You've done them for centuries, right? And all of a sudden, you have these converted Christians and the missionaries who are advocating on their behalf, saying, no, 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 that violates their religious right. It's idolatry for them to give money for these festivals that are meant for other gods, right? This man needs to come to church. You can't take him away to do forced labor, right? So this idea of personal liberty, religious liberty, starts being enacted in practice in local society, right? Now, what I write about mostly is the reaction. I wrote about that process, and the second half of my work kind of turns to the reaction against that, right? Because the moment you have someone saying, no, 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 I'm exempt, right? That creates problems for, say, the people who were able to kind of like these festivals, or this kind of little incense, they call it incense tax usually. Like, the people who are collecting that, that's their source of local prestige and power, right? That is their entire world view, their entire way of life are built on these practices. And they start to take notice of that, and they start becoming upset by it, right? And so there's a reaction against them. So you have things like churches being burnt down, right? Eventually, I write about in the 1890s. Before that, in isolated incidents too, you have uprisings against Christian populations within China, right? So that's what I tend to write about. But the rub of that is that these categories, when you are sticky, when you start thinking a certain way, even if you're, say, trying to react against this idea of religion, right? Personal religious belief. Well, no, your personal religious belief doesn't exempt that. Doesn't exempt you from this. You take up oftentimes, even in that kind of very term, right? And so it gets this idea of religion and its role in society. It's debated, it gets argued over, and soon people start taking it for granted that it's a real thing, that it's always been there, right? And so that happens in a historical sense in China, right, in the 19th century. Then you have Chinese scholars in the early 20th century, like Liang Qichao, thinking about this, like, well, is our religion good or bad? How do we make it good or bad, right? Do we get rid of it? Do we not? Then you have Chinese students in the 1920s saying, like, well, imperialism is bad. The Christian missionaries are bad. We need to get rid of religion, right? So there's the great anti-religion kind of movements of the 1920s, like get rid of religion so we can all progress, right? And so this idea of religion is taken for granted, and then scholars, much later, so some of my predecessors or colleagues take up these ideas, and they, I think, also forget that, like, this is not a real concept. It's not a real thing. It's a category that we use to describe certain activities in certain contexts. And
just a couple questions before we wrap up. I want to take this conversation slightly in a direction that listeners might have more familiarity with. So, when people think about anti-religious or anti-Christian movements in China, the perhaps non-specialist China might immediately not think about this movement, but think about the Cultural Revolution, where you had a number of churches that were destroyed. And people may wonder if Mao's understanding of how religion factors into China was influenced by this movement, or if he was influenced in particular by Chen Duxiu. Can you comment on sort of what influenced his understanding of religion's place, or rather its absence of its place in society?
yeah, well, so I mean, we have to remember that this is, first and foremost, a particular form of communist movement, right? And it definitely grows out of anti-imperialist struggles, which were often, not always, anti-missionary, right? Or at least took up religion as a problem, right? I call it the religion problem. And he is aware of a long anti-imperialist tradition and strain, not all in anti-imperialism is anti-missionary, so it is, that is calling religion into question, right? And so Mao is it's also part of some of his ideas that are larger communist beliefs, right? He, and anti-imperialist struggles, right? He very much is, in some ways, of the opinion, right, that like religion is something that has a negative influence on China's ability to modernize, and its ability to progress, its ability to create a healthy, rational, modern society, right? And we still have this question, right, of like, well, in the 50s especially, it gets, part of what this problematic leads to is the Chinese state defining religion, right? So China has like 5 religions that it officially recognizes, right? And everything else becomes superstition. And those 5 religions are actually pretty circumscribed, and like they keep it pretty. You have to look a certain way, right? You have to have an organized clergy. You have to report to the state. You have to have an organized set of written texts, right? And so, what is religion? Is it good? Is it bad? Very much shapes the way that these religions are practiced. I think it's Protestantism, Catholicism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Islam, right? Now, there's thousands of different religious practices, right, in China that don't make the cut, right, and they become superstition. This is still something that the Chinese state upholds, right? We see a lot of, and we see that kind of formulation of, and that pretext of religion as something that is particularly negative being used to tamp down on pretension, on any kind of religious practices necessarily that the state might see as a threat. Right? So that problematic of what is religion, right? It has far-reaching consequences, I think, up into the present day.
If you could just very briefly, if someone is listening to this episode and they're interested in knowing more about, like the history of religion in China or this general time period that you study, what would be one or two books that you would recommend?
Yes. I would particularly recommend Rebecca Nadostep's Superstitious Regimes. And then I would actually recommend, let me think. There's so many. It's actually a really hard thing to say. I think start with her book. And particularly the introduction would give a large overarching sense of the context of these debates.
Joshua, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Dakota.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or NakotaDefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.